Hi, this is Paul, and another video. I want to begin with a conversation between Julian and Nick on the Randos United channel. A really wonderful conversation, and if you're watching me and you've enjoyed some of the people that I've had conversations with, Julian and Nick are two of the best. And so here they're talking about the zeitgeist, the age that we're living in.
And I sort of picked also a word that sort of captures the zeitgeist as a whole. And the word I picked is an age of uncertainty because of, as far as I can tell, what's the most characteristic about our age is sort of this this prevalence of different ways of understanding the world, the collapse of a sort of coherent narrative, to use Vervaeken's terms, the collapse of a coherent narrative nomological or normative order. People sort of flailing about for trying to grasp onto something and then latching onto ideologies and simple solutions. But just this general sense of uncertainty and not being sure of of who we are, like our identities are in flux, not sure of where we should be headed, not sure where we're not even sure about practically anything. It seems like everything has multiple different ways. It's sort of spinning off into multiple different directions.
Yeah, I almost think of it as like a song with no bass or drum, right? It's all just mid-tones and treble, but there's nothing kind of like stabilizing or acting as a basic beat that everyone's kind of at least there's no common ground for anybody, which creates kind of sharp spiking out as people, like you said, kind of grasp or desperately move towards something to give them a sense of normalcy or security.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I don't know enough about music to completely get that, but I like the way of sort of, this sense of grounding seems to be lost, where the way I often think about it is just people seem to be floating around in midair in a way. But let me sort of run through.
Okay, then he's going to go from there. So I'll have the link below, and you can watch the whole video. This age of uncertainty, and I love how Nick illustrated it. It's like a song with no bass or drum, nothing belief, and then Julian, everything's just sort of floating, and Nick with sharp spiking out, but nothing stable. And, I picked this up in two other videos. I sent out a tweet with this. This is Jonathan Pageau talking to Jordan Greenhall on Rebel Wisdom. And interesting pairing, because Greenhall is sort of like Mr. Meta. And sometimes when I listen to him talk on these conversations, he spends so much time paying attention to the conversation that I don't know if he's paying attention to what the conversation is about. But Jonathan, so I actually gave up watching this video after about 20 minutes the first time, and a bunch of people in the Discord said, "No, you gotta keep watching it past that. It gets better." So it did get better. So this is Jonathan.
Wonderful, it's very difficult, and that's one of the things that I struggle with in terms of Jordan and in terms of Brett and in terms of Brett Weinstein and all these people, is that maybe that's why also I'm the explicit Christian in this whole thing, is that I don't see how how this stacks up, and I'm really struggling to see how it stacks up, because one of the things that, let's say, Jordan talks about is the individual, and I understand he says it, and he doesn't do it in a kind of individualist sense. He talks about taking responsibility, for things and being an active agent in the world, fixing the things around you, your community and everything. But it still has to stack up. It has to stack up to a higher degree. It's like, if you do that, let's say you fix your family and you do that, then those families also have to come together. And then those families have to come together. It has to has to go up higher. It has to come together in a higher sense. And so that's why I'm always I try to invoke, let's say, the medieval village as an image of an actual village, of an actual town, which has a hierarchy in the very architecture of the town, where you have the highest point of the town is the church steeple. It's usually at the center of the town. The town gets built around this church. That's the place. That's it. Like, that's the highest point. That's what we all look towards. We know that that's what binds us together. And so we go there to be bound to experience a common identity. And then we go back into our homes and we reproduce that identity in our families, and then we reproduce that in ourselves. Now I'm going top down. I know everybody's trying to go bottom up. That's fine. I don't have a problem with the bottom up, but I also think it's important to something to describe it coming top down. So, and I think that what that ends up looking like to a certain extent is identity. You can't get away from it. And so the desire so it's like, how can we deal with that? How can we deal with the reality of identities as this stacks up and not ignore it, but then also not create the danger of the extreme, let's say, rigid identity that we saw in 20th century nationalism? And so, but there has to be, it has to stack up towards identities. You can't just be a bunch of individuals and then have the state, like, have just this anonymous, post-national state country, like Justin Trudeau said about Canada.
So
Canada is the first post-national country.
What do you mean when you say identity?
Well, it can be all kinds of identity. Clans, exactly, like religious identities, like saying I'm a Christian, saying I'm a Canadian, saying I'm a French Canadian, that I share a common history, a common a common identity with other people. All these identities, they are inevitable in how the world stacks up. And so I feel like no one, at least like in this IDW group, everybody wants to avoid identity because they're saying, it has the sovereignty of the individual, everything, identity is dangerous. It's like, you can't, if it stacks up, you can't avoid it. So we need to find a balance. We need to talk about how we can find a way to balance these identities without, because that's what, let's say, like, that's the biggest criticism coming from the extreme right for people like Jordan Peterson. They're saying you're ignoring identity. You're pretending like it doesn't exist when it obviously it's going to exist. It's going to happen. But then they go way too far and they're like, okay, so now we're going to be, what is it like? It's like the white race and all these. To me, that's a bogus identity. But there are real identities in terms of cultural identities and all that.
And if you watch my last video, I got into identity, and I was talking about Charles Taylor's The Ethics of Authenticity, and Charles Taylor's observation that when identity, Jonathan very much got into top down and bottom up, and what Charles Taylor was noting was that identity was given top down. Identity was received. It was not achieved. And when identity is received, that identity is, especially in something, let's say, like a medieval village, like Jonathan is talking about, when that identity is received, that identity is already nested within a structure. And so a person knows how they are to be in different situations within that structure. And now let's again zip back to Jordan Peterson thinking about how maybe a lot of this stuff emerges from history, but it takes very long time to actually create those structures and to have them become top down. Okay, now that again, when you start talking about this kind of stuff and you start talking about priority, the truth is conceptually the dominant frame, the scientific frame in which we live biases towards a priority of bottom up, because it's the only way we feel comfortable, because you cannot have secularity and this top down, because the iron box of secularism does not allow you to see the stars. Okay, so now what you have in a medieval village, of course, is as Jonathan notes, is you have something at the center, which is the church spire, and everyone can see the church spire from miles around. I was listening to Karen talk to Carl, and Carl was talking about how he grew up in that village in France by a very famous cathedral, and you could see that the spires of that famous cathedral from miles around, and wherever you were in that region, you knew where you are by virtue of your location relative to the church, and the church was holding together heaven and earth. And if you continue watching this Rebel Wisdom video, Jonathan will continue to lay that out. And so there's this deep longing for this because, well, now suddenly we realize, well, there's identity. And so people are grasping at certain, first they grasp at an identity, let's say 50 years ago in the 70s and in the Born That Way era. You grasped at an identity that was given to you from birth. And what's happening now is that suddenly we've changed that and we've said, well, that's assigned at birth. And so now with sex, male or female, we say, well, that is assigned at birth. And it's not going to be very long. And in fact, we've already seen it with, I forget her name, the woman that identified as black and was very active in her NAACP, and then everybody kind of can you identify as a black person just like you can identify as a man or identify as a woman, and if you watch the trends, this is going to come. It's not a matter of, oh, we're just going to hold this back. You're sort of going to be like, everybody pointing at impotent churches trying to hold back the tides of time by saying, well, if my sex is assigned at birth, well, then isn't my race assigned at birth? And everything is assigned at birth. And of course, now you have a crisis of authenticity because you don't know the source of authenticity. And again, when you had the possibility of a top-down universe, well, it was assigned to you by the God. Your location was assigned to you by the God. You can watch Fiddler on the Roof for this. Tradition. This is how we know who we are, and this is how we live. And when all of this is ripped away, we don't know what to do. Now I want to go on and what struck me so interesting is that this is an interview with Kanye on Beats One. Now, this is an Apple station, and Apple is notorious for protecting its intellectual property, so I'm going to edit this in such a way that if I post this thing and it immediately gets flagged and limited by YouTube, you might not see this clip. If it didn't get flagged and limited by YouTube, then you are going to see the clip. So I'm just going to warn you with that. But so actually this morning I finished listening to this entire video. And now Kanye is going to be a tremendously debated figure in this. In fact, I already this morning caught an article on the Religious News Network that was basically saying that, Kanye is just playing a white game, and Kanye is doing this for, in other words, they're saying he's not authentic in any of this because there are other high-profile rappers who have been making noises about Christianity, but so people wonder what's Kanye's game, and I completely understand their hesitation because Kanye his identity has changed so often. In fact, and Jonathan in his video about Kanye, I think laid this out in some really helpful ways. I mean, Kanye is sort of a trickster clown figure, but okay, so that's in a sense a role that Kanye is playing. But if you sit back and you think about what it means to be Kanye, and so now Kanye didn't have the experience of growing up in the hood like some other rappers had. He wasn't really so much of a gangbanger. His mother was a scholar, and she and her father divorced. His father was first a leader in the Black Panthers, and then his father became a very serious Christian and became a Christian counselor. And you can hear this in one of Kanye's songs in his latest album. And so right away, you can see the forces that are at play at Kanye, and he talks quite graphically in this in this video, and he talks about his life. He talks about his sexual addiction and his addiction to pornography. And now here's the thing about celebrities who grow famous and wealthy and rich, to the degree that just about any of the rest of us listening to this never taste. Suddenly what happens when that happens to you is now your desires no longer have sort of the normal limitations that keep many of us from running off the rails. And so what happens in so many celebrity lives is that, in fact, they run off the rails, and they keep running off the rails, some of them dramatically with successful suicides and some of this. Now Kanye he was diagnosed as bipolar, so, he already has that tendency in him. He developed a sexual addiction. He talked about the fact that when he was 5 years old, his father left a Playboy lying around, and ever since he saw that Playboy, boom, that was a reality. And so when you think about his life, it is not rocket science to imagine him getting to a point, especially after he has a daughter. And again, you can hear these themes in his latest album, especially after he has a daughter, and he's thinking about his daughter's life. And in terms of his motivation for his Sunday service, it's very clear that his daughter is a big part of this, that he wants his daughter to grow up with a base, with a foundation, because he's looking for this foundation. And so what he's doing to try to find this foundation is a very old strategy. It was practiced by, in a sense, the Pilgrims, who took the Mayflower across the ocean to establish a city on a hill in a wilderness. And so Kanye bought a whole bunch of land in Wyoming, and this is where he's doing this interview, and he's explaining how what Kanye is going to do is Kanye is dreaming at this point of building his city on a hill, and he's going to build a compound, and depending on how much of a following and if he lets other people in and all of this, I mean, this could become very cult-like in that he wants to establish his city on a hill out there in Wyoming. But he is feeling, now we know that Kanye had watched Jordan Peterson. We don't know whether or not he watched Jonathan Pageau, and he certainly didn't have enough time to watch that interview on Rebel Wisdom, because this was actually taped before that one. But here Kanye says almost exactly the same thing that Jonathan Pageau said. And that is so interesting, especially given, again, the differences between them. So I'm going to, again, if I don't show you the videotape, it's because Apple wouldn't let me. So hang on. Okay, here goes. We'll see if Apple lets me use this thing.
Are made. I mean, it's really about control. We have to be in control of our own minds, of our own food.
Now, control of our own minds. And one of the ways that you should understand Kanye's journey towards Christianity right now is he's trying to get control of his life. And again, this is such a common motivation and common strategy why people pursue Christianity, because life is chaotic. They're trying to bring order, and so they need a power greater than themselves to restore sanity to their lives, right out of the 12 steps of AA.
Our health and our families. Well, that's what I was going to say. When I arrived, I said I didn't know whether this was 3,000 years, whether I'm 3,000 years in the past or 3,000 years in the future being on this ranch, because it's so isolated and really you're in the elements. Apart from this cozy environment, we're in the elements right here. This has just been planted in the middle of the space, and it sounds.
So this little bit of order in the middle. You can watch the wind blowing outside. The chaos of the wild. This is so American what's happening here.
To me, like you want to go back to go forward, like you want to go back and use some of these techniques and these ideas in order to
Rome is
dismantle it ultimately.
Yeah, like Rome is the true Silicon Valley of humanity. A lot of
now that's such a complicated thing that he said right there. There's a ton of truth to it. So again, I haven't really had a chance to dive deep into Dominion yet, but I was reading Tom Holland's Dynasty, and you just go through in Tom Holland's Dynasty the language that we have inherited from Rome. It's It is the foundation of our language, and so much of just the mental frameworks that we bring. And of course, as Christianity colonized the Roman Empire, a lot of these things come to us through the Western Church.
The ideas and things that we need are from thousands and thousands of years ago. It's just like, what do we need for our Maslow's hierarchy of need chart? What are our personal needs as a human being? And what we need the most is each other. That's why we gather together, just like the antelopes that are running out there. We gather together. And what is the best form of each other? Family, to keep our families close. But
now, family is, of course, this biological thing, but then marriage is the way to make family out of someone who's not biologically related to you. And then you get to Jonathan Pageau's, families have to join together with families, and they all have to come together, and that's critical because we need each other.
Cities have been designed to create more problems that can create more industries.
Okay, now part of what happens here is Jonathan Pageau talks about the medieval village, and that's important because, well, what destroyed the medieval village? Well, the city destroyed the medieval village. Well, what is the city? Well, the city challenges the village because, in a sense, one way to understand the story of humanity is the degree to which we can figure out how to live together in bigger and bigger groups. And what that living together in bigger and bigger groups actually requires are bigger and bigger stories within which to inhabit. Okay, and again, don't forget Jordan Peterson's biblical series and all of this stuff about the dream and Jung, and this is the narrative is sort of, again, the machine code by which humanity can orient itself, can live together, and do all of this, which is why, again, story is so foundational in this. And so the city, in a sense, kills the medieval village, but then the question is, well, can we manage the city? Now, it's also important to remember that there's an ancient map of the Roman Empire, which doesn't look like any of our maps because all it looks like are all of the cities and the nodes that connect and the lines that connect them. Because for the Romans, the cities, civitas, city is civilization. And now, again, the Bible begins in a garden and ends in a city. And so, all of these things, in fact, do tie together. Now Kanye is complaining about the fact that cities have had a corrupted influence. So now, again, this is very American. Out to the frontier, out to the wilderness, out to these spaces. But what's he going to build when he gets out to the wilderness?
So it's designed that your job is 45 minutes away so that you can spend time in traffic so that the cars have more wear and tear and spend more gas and take more gas. But to think of communities where the church is in the center of the community, and then the school, cafeterias, sustainable gardening, and homes. This is the concept that I have. This is what me and Rick Fox went to the Bahamas as we're working on hurricane-proof homes right now. We're thinking of how to look at the amount of wind that's coming through. These houses are going to be way lower than I put on here. So this is not a hurricane, obviously.
No, but it whips through.
Yeah, and when I was creating the domes,
and it's energy too, right? That's what you were saying before. God,
the
elements give you what you need. Is what you're saying.
Yeah, God gives us everything that we need. What I love.
Now, again, it's a fascinating conversation between these two, and it goes a lot of different places. But I'm gonna break here so that if I have to, in fact, not include this, I can not include this, and I can easily just have the video without it. So as you just finished saying that, so Jonathan Pageau has the medieval village, and in a sense, Kanye, he's going to have his medieval village, but Kanye is going to try to figure, well, how can this stack up? And so what he's going to try and produce, once again, one of the things that we've seen again and again, well, he's going to produce his city on a hill, and it's going to have a church at the center, and then school and cafeterias and housing, and again, it almost sounds like a commune of sorts. Now, with King Kanye, but it's going to be very interesting to see how this thing develops. And again, this has been played through many, many times. I remember in college when I had my undergrad in history, and we read this remarkable book about the story of Dedham, Massachusetts, that again tried to construct this. The Oneida community at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of communities that attempted to construct this. Salt Lake City, the Mormons tried to build this a number of times, and then finally had to run far enough out into the wilderness to build their city on a hill. And of course, until dwarfed by skyscrapers, the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, attempted to orient the whole thing. This has been tried many, many times. And part of what we're dealing with, again, what killed the medieval village was the city. And in fact, the movement towards the Protestant Reformation was very much an urbanization movement that, of course, got coupled with the printing press, and so there's a lot of stuff going on with all of these elements. Now, in some ways, the Enlightenment proponents like Steven Pinker, they just seem so remarkably naive to so much of this, and it's all just that, oh, there'll be problems, but we'll fix them with technology, because what people are people are good in themselves, and then when they see a problem, which is out there, they find a technical solution to fix the problem, and then people can continue to be good and happy and joyful and everything else. And so these values, again, are self-evident, which, if you watched my video where I talked about Pinker and Peterson and Tom Holland, well, if these values are so self-evident, why didn't we find them until the modern period? Why weren't these values obvious to the Aztec or the Inca or to the Egyptians or to everyone else who supposedly had all of these bad days that we imagine ourselves to have evolved beyond? There's not a lot self-evident about this stuff at all, quite frankly. And so applying reason to objects in space to produce well-being and eliminate suffering, well, yeah, but people don't work that way. In fact, again, as a pastor, I work with people all the time, and part of what's interesting about the medieval village versus, let's say, the city, as we see with Pageau and Kanye moving towards it, well, the problem is other people. Hell is other people. Watch that play. You can find it on YouTube. And this is what, again, as a pastor, I see again and again. It's people struggling to get along. And if you want to understand this, look no further than marriage, because you have two people who now, in the modern period, their parents, again, don't put them together, but two people get to choose themselves. Okay, this is very modern. Two people get to choose their own mate, and they supposedly know themselves better than their parents could know them, being 18 or 20 or 25 years old. And so they choose each other, and then they go and they stand in that center of the village, and everybody wants to get married in this, in a nice, cozy church. Well, now we have these destination weddings, and Jonathan Pageau could do a whole video on church weddings versus destination weddings. But and so then these two people that stand up in front of their closest friends and pledge undying love, usually within 7 years will be at each other's throats at some point. Well, why is that? Well, that says something about human beings. And it seems that the Enlightenment is just simply naive in some ways about that. We're going to establish larger and larger human communities through contracts. Well, what do contracts beget but lawyers? And what are lawyers but people who are paid to argue and fight on behalf of others over contracts? And so, this stuff has been basically undermined since the beginning of the 20th century. Modernity died in the battlefields of the First World War and really got hit hard in the Second World War. But it seems that we can't give up on this vision and this hope. We want to see ourselves as good, and we want to see value as self-evident, and we want to imagine that with goodwill and rationality, we can fix the world's problems, and then everyone will get along and be at peace. And it'll be John Lennon's song all over again. Now, I would argue that materiality isn't cutting it. Now, I did a debate earlier this week on the debate channel, this modern debate where modern day debate, and I debated Vaush and I didn't know who he was, but it was really had a wonderful time doing it, and I thought the conversation was fruitful and productive. It was, of course, sort of debate-ish in that we're arguing for different points, but someone had warned me before the debate that this guy can get nasty. I thought, oh, well, how nasty can it be? I'm sitting in my office. What's he going to do? Bang on the door? I got a lot nastier people who bang on my door regularly. I got to deal with these characters. This shouldn't be too bad. But we had a wonderful time, and we had a wonderful conversation. So, and my point is that actually, the more we pursue this, if, Jonathan Pageau wants a medieval village and Kanye wants to establish his medieval village, but the city keeps growing. And if you establish a successful village, well, the world will beat a path to your door. And what you see is that more money and more rationality doesn't produce the kinds of outcomes we imagine it should. And so what I'm going to do actually here is just insert this into this video, so I won't be in my little box commenting on myself. That might be just a little bit too meta, but I'm just going to insert it here and give you a chance to know what went on.
This is where I unveil my true power level, because I believe that humans work best operating communally. I think that one of the most horrific things that modern liberalism, like capitalism, anything post-enlightenment, one of the most horrid things it's done to us is it's forced us off, to cordoned us into these little suburban boxes where you don't know the name of your neighbor across the street, where you work gig jobs, you barely know the name of your employees before you're fettered out to work your next. You're alienated. And I think that's what people are suffering from, really. And it happens in our relationships too. Nobody has the monetary to commit. The bedrock is gone. It's just people now, lonely and trying not to end up on the street, which is easy. There are a lot of support programs out there. At least it's easy for some. But to live comfortably, that is incredibly hard now. And I wonder if we couldn't accommodate this new frenetic life, which will surely soon see changes, with a different type of dynamic, a different way of addressing that alienation. Socialism.
I
throwing it in at the end. So you
sneak socialism underneath.
Just slide it underneath the paper slip under the door.
Whoa, socialism! How'd you get in here? I agree with a lot of what you're saying. It's interesting, however, that in almost every case, women initiate divorce, yet divorce is almost always catastrophic for the women and children. And so, whereas I certainly agree with you that the past, let's say the past corporate model, where in the 50s and 60s you had the company man who had a pension being managed by the corporation and good job security and sufficient income so that his wife could, stay home with the kids. I think a lot of people would give their eye teeth for that today. And that's simply gone. And so there's no question in my mind. I've lived and worked most of my life in Black communities in America. My father planted a church in the struggling Black community of the First Ward of Paterson, New Jersey. I live in a multi-everything community in Sacramento, California. And the economic factors undermining many of these communities' ability to sustain a marriage is significant. On the other hand, and I very much agree with you that humans work best operating communally, And as a pastor, what I would say is that the question is, how can people work communally? Because the struggles that people have working community are sometimes financial. But again, in most cases, even if there's one of the members of the family is marginally or underemployed, the other member of the family is better employed, you've still got two income earners. If they can get along, managing to keep one household together, and generally speaking, financially, people do better that way. I've known people, there was one young man who was coming to church for a while, and his parents were divorced and still living together. They hated each other's guts, but they couldn't afford to live separately. And so, on one hand, there certainly is the economic aspect, but on the other hand, what it actually takes for two people to get along over 20, 30 years goes way beyond some romantic notions of love. And I completely agree with you that a big part of this has been the demise of institutions and institutional learning that not only encourages people to work hard on their marriages and their relationships with the people with which whom they share a home, but also provides support to help them get along. In many cases, if a marriage is in crisis, within 6 years, they'll work it out if they can stick with it and work on it and negotiate it out. And there are, just the way that society is structured now, and I think it's a good thing that society, a woman can get out of a marriage just as easily as a man can today. And I think that's a good thing. The difficulty that we have are when people come into marriage with sort of a selfish, personal aspect that says, I'm going to stay in this relationship for as long as it suits me. You're never going to be able to build a marriage on that. And there's going to have to be another foundation upon which the relationship needs to stand for the marriage to be sustainable and have really legs going into the future.
Okay, 100% agreed. I think 2 points to that. The first thing that I would ask, I'm really split on this. On one hand, and I can be open about my position on this. I believe very much in like polyamory. I want like polycules to be an ideal relationship. I think that people are generally stronger in structures of more than two people. Obviously, as being young, I've met plenty of people who've had less than successful, triages into that type of lifestyle. But I think that under certain circumstances, it can produce pretty stable bonds. And I wouldn't be opposed to seeing this explored kind of as a broader model. So my bias here is evident. And sometimes I do think in that way that you just described rather disparagingly, this I'm in here for my own benefit, excluding a kid, by the way. Of course, I don't have a child. I wouldn't just like ditch in a child. But I'm here for my benefit. If I'm not having fun, I can dip. That's my right. I have that right. And on one hand, there is some validity to that. I get one life. I don't believe in afterlife personally. Even you would agree. We have one life here. I've got my one chance.
I don't want more than one here. So
that's
say that to the reincarnation folks. I believe in reincarnation. You want to come around again?
Listen. Okay, don't depress my chat members. Look, life is suffering. It's good character building. How do you strike a happy balance between getting people to commit? And I mean that in the healthiest way imaginable, not like to your dying breath you're bound, but how do you get people to invest in one another without getting people to paint over the red flags? Because abuse in relationships is like a really common thing in every segment of society, every race, every type of relationship, homosexual, heterosexual, every age. This happens like a lot. And the ability to divorce easily is good in a way because it lets people get out of that situation unless they have kids or unless they don't have the money to. But on the other hand, a frivolity of thought when we approach relationships probably does lead to us feeling kind of empty at the end of the day. How do you find a working ground between painting over abuse and horrid relationships people should get out of and encouraging people to stick it out, to be together?
A couple nights ago, I I watched on Netflix. I watched the documentary Surviving R. Kelly, and that was a fascinating program in
I heard
terms
that was
of,
a hot one. Yeah.
oh
Whew, that was.
wow. And so, you've got women who are living in separate rooms in his studio who, are peeing into a bucket and have to check in with him to leave their room, and he's having them in all kinds of different permutations, taking videotapes of it. A bunch of these women are underage, and towards the end of it, there's one mother who is trying to get her daughter out of there after 9 years. And they haven't been able to lock this man up because none of the women seem to want to go to court and say, yeah, this is what he did. And so that, I think, is an illustration of just how tricky psychologically dynamics of abuse can be. And anyone who's dealt with battered women and some of those dynamics know just how difficult this can be when you really have a monster manipulator, someone like R. Kelly. At least that program certainly portrayed him to be. So that is certainly something. I think the deep problem with our contemporary approach is simply this: we look at people as means to an end. This person, or even this relationship, is a way to make me happy. And that's the commodification of other human beings. And I believe that human beings are not to be used, but are to be loved. Now you have the question. Now then we say, well, how can we get people to? Well, first of all, let me tell you, as a pastor, there's no getting people to do anything. I make a living talking to people and telling them what they're all willing to support me saying to them, and them turning around and not wanting to do it, because it is not natural for us to love in the kind of ways we all want to be loved. And what it takes, and I think you're very much when you say humans work best operating in community, because what it takes is for the community to be gathered and focused and in agreement around certain values and factors, such as human beings are to be loved and not used. And what that means when you go into a marriage is that you say, I am not going into this marriage for my happiness. I am going into this marriage for the sake of the other. Now, there's definitely that can get twisted in an abusive relationship, and that certainly does happen. And there needs to be intervention when that does happen. But what it takes is for one person to basically say, I am going to lay down my life for another person. Usually not to that extreme, but when you have a child, you lay down your life for that child, because there's no more selfish individual in the world than a newborn, because that newborn wakes up in the middle of the night and says, I want to be fed, I want to be changed, I want it right now. You talk to that newborn all you want, it ain't going to make a difference. And so what we do, and what marriage actually teaches us, is to learn to love. And what love means is to lay down our life and give our lives for others. And how do you create a community where people live that way and are surrounded by that value? Well, that's what I do as a pastor. We as a society have looked at that and said, well, we don't think we want that. It's like, okay, but then you get the consequence of people saying, I want to find someone who's going to make me happy. Well, that's sort of a nice way of saying, I'm going to use this other person for my happiness. And I'd say long term, whether it's 2 people or 3 people or 4 people, it doesn't work.
There are a lot I can see in my chat scrolling by. There are a lot of people who like that take. To clarify, what do you mean by it's not natural to love someone in the way you want to be loved?
I think all of us would like to imagine we can be with someone who will love for us and care for us. And let's say something would happen to us. We'd get in a car accident, we'd get Alzheimer's, something like this, that our spouse would stand by us until the day we die. That's what we all want. But for that, and I've seen enough spouses who their wife or their husband had Alzheimer's or a stroke, and they they cleaned up after them, they fed them, they cared for them, and they did it sometimes for years, even decades. We all want that out of others, but what it takes to give requires not just, I want to be the kind of person that takes care of my spouse. It actually does take a community that has the values that reinforce that kind of sacrificial giving. And one of the things that you said earlier, I think, comes into that. When we say in our lives, I have just one life, this is my shot to get happiness and meaning and everything I want out of it. If you go into life that way, at some point you're going to look at the equation and say, I'm sitting here tied to this person that has Alzheimer's. I could dump them in a hospital and this person wouldn't even know. They don't even remember my name, and then go out and get my happiness, because after all, I deserve it. That's what society is saying. And this is the results we're seeing in society, is what you get from that kind of valuation. And now I would argue as a Christian minister that actually, if in this world, you make this world better, if you actually can imagine to say, you know what, I can sacrifice my time and my life for this spouse that I've had a complicated relationship with, but I'm going to be faithful to him or her until they die, because actually I believe I have eternity to live, which will be a lot better than this place right here. So I can do that. Now, again, I appreciate the fact that most of us hear that and say, I don't know about that, but that's because we're looking at life through one set of lenses. But we sure want our neighbors and our spouses and our children to believe that. And so if we want them to believe it, well, it takes a community that actually keeps raising up those values and puts them forward. And I think that's part of the reason that we have all of these ideas that, well, we deserve to be loved. Well, do we have what it takes to actually love?
Pretty convincing. There's a deep philosophical split on this one, I think. Not even a split necessarily, a split perspective, or maybe an incongruence between two values. Because I agree with everything that you just said in regards to the validity in loving people beyond utilitarianism, to be able to appreciate one's company, or to care for someone, even if in some broad hard numbers sense you recognize that your life utility is not being maxed out by those actions. It's important, however, to stick by those things. And everyone's fondest memories of compassion and trust, I think, are from people who did that. If they were sick or unwell and somebody else cared for them, even though it would have made all the sense in the world for them to leave. For many people, this would be parents. For some people, it would be a close partner. For some, it would even be their children. And that's what everyone wants. And you're right. Not everyone has a mindset which is amicable towards that mentality. Though I suppose if you really went back on it, if you really parse the numbers or something, you could argue that the sublime experience of deep, reciprocal, unconditional compassion between two people would maximize utility. But it's a mindset thing. A question then, in regards to JBP, then to cycle it back, I think to the man himself. This is one issue that I have with him that I think extends to his self-help more specifically than it does his politics. He's said, somewhat hypocritically, it turned out, because he's now being taken care of for his addiction problem, which I won't make fun of. I don't think that's proved at all. But he did say that it is one should ensure their room is clean before trying to change the world. Essentially, that you should make sure your own house is in order, everything's set, you're fine, you're good, before affecting change. But you and I agree on something. A lot of the reason why people are experiencing this horrid alienation from their life, their inability to form meaningful bonds, is because a lot of the institutional structures that made those livelihoods possible and affordable have begun to crumble. And this is one key distinction I have here. I think that in many cases, one's room is unclean because of the society in which we live. And in order to clean that room, that society must be changed. I would see, for example, the economic superstructures that are failing so many people right now changed, not necessarily by people who have their act together, but from the people who don't because of those systems. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I agree. The difficulty that we have with systems are that they are made of people. And so what's sort of, it's always it's always hard to know. Well, just think about, whatever group of people you're living with now. If you're living with other people, maybe it's in the context of an apartment building, or maybe it's in a neighborhood, or maybe it's within one household. You could say, well, what does it take for us to be a household that keeps our own house clean and does the dishes? And so if you've ever lived with roommates in college, you have some roommates that are slobs and some roommates who are neatniks. And so you could say, well, which is it? Is it us as a group, or is it us as an individual? And it's always both. And one of the when he said, keep your house in perfect order before you go out to fix the world, basically. Perfect was such a poor choice of words there, because the truth is none of us are perfect. But the question of society first or the individual first, that's always a very difficult one. What I like to say is that without individuals, nothing changes, and without institutions, nothing lasts. And so part of what we're seeing is that there's certainly, the market in some ways likes to incentivize the commodification of people. And that's a real problem. And
I agree completely.
And so employers who, politically, you might have, you probably don't know anything about my politics, but it doesn't matter. I have a problem with industries that don't give health care to their employees. If we're going to have employers, if we're going to run healthcare through employers, and I would be in favor of, a lot more than that. And so there's no question in my mind that we can use some structural change, but the question of individual versus societal, that's a weakness, I think, with Jordan Peterson that I think was manifest in his program that I saw as a pastor, because again, I saw he's out there talking about the individual. Great. It's very true that I can't change anyone I'm living with. I can only change myself. I should be the change, to use that little thing, and act the way I want others to act. I have to do that first. But you're exactly right. And that's what I'm saying in terms of marriage. There needs to be an institution and a community around us that reinforces those values. And community certainly works better when we have some assurance that the others with which we are sharing this community have the same value. It's being reinforced, and we can all work on it together.
Yeah. If you, I'm trying to think, like, what would, so politics aside, and of course, well, there is no such thing. All of this is deeply political, but I should say, political differences between myself and JBP aside, I'm trying to think now, what would be the optimal JBP if you could construct them somehow. Somebody, a person sent, I don't know if you're from God, I don't know. So somebody constructed to help people out of the alienation which seems to accompany modern society. When I think of that person, I think of, I'm of course biased by my politics. I think of somebody who's very far left, who wants to build a really strong economic base to allow everyone to live a dignified life, because we have the money for it. At least here in America, we could, with proper incentive structures, have everyone live at least a lower middle class living with no like substantive economic issues, to ensure everyone can enjoy a baseline standard of living, which is certainly above what welfare provides us today, which is pitiful in this day and age in this country, and which encourages people to form strong communal relations with others, to be trusting and open, to be disciplined. Absolutely, that's important, but also to be open to the possibility that sometimes the issues that are affecting their life are not an evidence of personal failing, but rather evidence that the house in which they live, the society in which they live, needs correcting, to ensure a revolutionary mindset in people, a willingness always to challenge social institutions, so that there will always be a sort of the civil spirit necessary to maintain the common dignity of the average citizen. What does an ideal JBP look to you? Like, how do they deliver that?
Oh, I think I think we have the JBP that there is, and I think he's done a lot of good, and I'm satisfied with that. I I'm reluctant to boil I'm reluctant to boil these issues down to economics. I spent 7 years of my life living in the Dominican Republic, working mostly with Haitians, and I cannot recall a single instance of a suicide attempt amongst those Haitians. And these people, for the most part, were illegal immigrants in a far poorer country than the United States, living in grass huts and shacks made of garbage, and basically working for tyrannical either government organizations or coffee growers and scratching out a living, working gardens. I watched the David Chappelle thing on Netflix last night, and he makes the point at the beginning of it. Anthony Bourdain has about the best job that any of us could imagine, flying around the world, eating the world's best food, talking to the world's most interesting people. That's his job, and he kills himself. And the Haitians living in those huts in the Dominican Republic, I never once heard of a suicide. And so the confidence that I have that a predominantly economic program would yield the kind of well-being we imagine, I don't think actually pertains. Because as a pastor, you get to see the lives of people, and I've seen a lot of very unhappy people with a lot of money and a lot of people who enjoy life. I grew up mostly around African-American folks, and, some of the best times I've had have been with just hanging out with junkies and poor folks. And life is hard, but they've got meaning and happiness. And I think, again, one of the main things that Peterson communicated was that the quest for happiness is not as simple as we imagine it to be. And what's actually true is that meaning is a far more sustainable entity, and that which in fact is most in distress. Every now and then I'll do a sermon that touches on suicide. One of the things I noted is that one of the places in the United States with the highest suicide rate was a high school in Silicon Valley. The children of the titans of industry that have more going for them in terms of economic security than any of us on this channel would ever hope for. And so I think if we're looking for well-being predominantly from an economic rearrangement, I think we'll be dissatisfied.
I mean, that's one of the grand paradoxes, right? Right now, the suicide rate in America is at its highest for middle-aged white men who are demographically much better off than many of the other constituencies. Suicide rates are, as you noted, at least for the American Black community, substantially lower than they are on average for the white community. It's the same for Hispanics. I'm inclined to believe this is because of their family structure. Also, there's
which is traditional.
Oh, no denying that. But I wonder if the conditions of traditional family structures and how they positively affect one's well-being could be supplemented in a less traditional way that nonetheless keeps the spirit of the original organization. I remember this is something that's always stuck with me. It's something that I read a very long time ago. I did bother to look it up. It is true, even if the citations have left me now. But I remember there was a Greek philosopher who existed some 2000, whatever, ancient Greek philosopher. And he was interested in the study of happiness, which I guess we would now term as like meaningfulness or well-being or contentedness, because it wasn't just like, haha, happy. And what he discovered, and he was laughed at, he was ridiculed by his contemporaries because all the other philosophers were learning about form and meaning and the essence of consciousness. And he was off trying to find how to have a good time. And what he discovered, from his teachings, at least, was that the best way for a human being to be happy would be for them to live along with 8 to 12 friends in a villa, which was suitably sized such they all had private bedrooms, but shared communal spaces such as living rooms, dining rooms, kitchens, and such. And he believed after all of his life that this was the optimal way for human beings to live. And he died, as one does. And other people, I think, eventually took towards following his writings after his passing. Epicurus, chat says.
That's him. Yep.
Okay. Epicurus. I sound much smarter now. And other people took that teaching. And I am deeply moved by that idea because I've kind of wanted the same thing my life too. I grew up with very good parents, you know, and I'm very happy for everything they gave me. But it was nonetheless a boxy home where I knew not the names of my neighbors. The idea of living in a shared space is almost like a dorm. I think this is why so many people have fond memories of their dorm experiences, and probably corresponding negative ones as well. The idea of living like that, it's very enticing to me. And if you want to branch it out into sort of more of a relationship dynamic, there's the potential for sort of segmented, like your space with you and your partner, then the broader space with other families, and maybe you have the kids, but you know the others well enough that they could babysit for you, like on the way out. You share, like two of you share a kitchen or two groups. It's very compelling. And what would be needed to see changes like that, or changes like how we structure homes so people live together, or changes in the workplace to ensure that workers aren't like just getting through the day with no ability to talk to one another due to really oppressive corporate rules. All of these are economic changes. How we design our homes, how we build our workplaces, how our schools are designed. How do we teach resource officers to deal with those who are suffering from depression? How much emphasis do we place on people's well-being following a depressive episode? All of these are economic or social changes. And that's what I really want to see. Not just making everyone wealthier, but building these structures that are facilitated around human happiness rather than capital acquisition. And I feel like, at least from what you said, that at least in regards to the sentiment, you may agree with a lot of that.
Well, the question I would have is, 2,300 years ago, Epicurus tried this. Why didn't it win the day? And then my question for you would be, when you go on vacation, do you stay in a hostel or a hotel?
Well, I will admit that I stay in a hotel. I have heard people say that they have positive experiences from hostels, and there might be other reasons why that's the case. Hostels tend to be very disgusting, for example. But if, for example, there was a way
makes
to
them disgusting?
Oh, well, of people, of course. But if they're people you care about and know and live with, Epicurus's ideas didn't take on because there's not much money to be had in making people happy. There's money to be had in making people scared. But we got close, I think, with villages in feudal times. While, I mean, obviously people there were barren and wretched and miserable and had shit on their face all of the time, at the very least they had meaning within a community who they cared about. Things were dirty there, not denying that. And it was mostly it was the horses, I imagine, who made it dirty. But they lived their lives, and there was a meaningfulness to that. And I think we can extrapolate that communal spirit into how society functions today without returning to this this modernist liberal traditional idea of I mean liberal in like the Enlightenment sense, idea of like the nuclear family where people get locked off into these boxes. It feels like a grim return to an attempt at replicating the joy of an earlier and perhaps less profitable, but nonetheless superior system.
Do you know the American corporation that has the vision statement, "Make people happy"?
I mean, I've heard it before. Is it Facebook?
No, it's Disney.
Okay. That's so. I should have gotten that. That's a clear one.
And do they make much money?
I mean, hey, listen. I mean, if your point is that capitalism does a poor job of meeting human need, then I'm with you. I'm with you all the way.
My point is that happiness is people. I don't think people finally want happiness. They will trade their life for meaning. And ironically, I think, if we come all the way back to the question of Jordan B. Peterson, that is what's actually at the heart of, the first book that he wrote is more important book, which is not very readable, is Maps of Meaning, because people will go to war and be killed on the battlefield. People will put their bodies and lives at risk in childbirth. People will sacrifice everything that they have for meaning, but they will even, in fact, sacrifice their happiness for meaning. And I think if we can get an understanding of that, we might actually be able to figure out what kinds of institutions and social arrangements would actually give us more well-being than just, I think Epicurus in the end didn't succeed in changing the world because he was wrong. And I would argue that someone named Jesus Christ actually changed the world far more than Epicurus, and I would argue that he did so because he was right.
I don't think you can meaningfully extrapolate the validity of a position for how popular it is. There have been plenty of intelligent and wise men who have died penniless in the sewers, and plenty of idiots who have been elected to high office. I mean,
Jesus didn't make any money.
Jesus Christ's elevated reputation notwithstanding, there is plenty of empirical evidence to suggest that communal living is a good way about to live one's life. And I think that you see facsimiles of this in poorer communities as well. Now, I admit I'm speaking here not from experience, but only from reading, because I am rather privileged in my upbringing. But in everything that I have read and scantly encountered in some of the poorest communities in this country, the whatever glimpses of meaning and validity they picked from their lives were in a shared bond with their neighbors, with their community, and a willingness to do whatever it took to maintain the well-being of that community. To an irrational degree.
The more affluent people get, the more isolated they live, and that's exactly what we're seeing in North America.
Agreed,
The family size is shrinking, the more money we get. And so that's why I argue if you put the emphasis on economic well-being, you're not actually going to address these questions of community.
What if you put the emphasis on economic socialization, redesigning social structures in a way that facilitate human contact? Everything, our workplaces, our schools, the way in which we get services from others. Now we just click a button on Amazon, it arrives at our door. Our families, all of it is getting more expedient and more distant. If we could find ways to streamline these systems in a way that facilitated human contact, I think that you would see people form a much more genuine bond with their community. And I think really good things can come from that.
I think the most expedient way to do that would be to have them have less money, and there would be more people living together, and you would.
Is that a Posadist I hear? Do you believe that true happiness can only come from the flames of apocalyptic nuclear hellfire? Only after we nuke the country can we rebuild and become truly one?
No.
Have you not heard of Posadism?
No.
Okay.
Now, if you watch a lot of atheist Christian debates, usually the way they sort of go is the argument ironically underneath it, I think as Tom Holland's thesis really helps us establish, is that they're using Christian values to critique Christians. The values we believe, the values that and dreams that we have are significantly formed by Christianity. And Rene Girard makes exactly the same point, and I've made it in a number of videos, that we use Christianity to critique Christianity because we don't have anything else, because it's already the most beautiful vision that we can find. And we don't know how we got here. This is another huge problem with humanity. And it's in fact especially a problem in modernity. Traditional peoples would always orient themselves to the future by looking to the past. Now you can see Kanye, after living in the maelstrom of outrageous success and wealth, and well, what happens if you get everything your heart desires? Well, don't listen to Willy Wonka. It destroys your life, because sex? Yes, please. Food? Yes, please. Money? Yes, please. More. And pretty soon you discover that you're completely gone. And so this is Kanye's fight to, well, how can I rein in my appetites? Well, you're going to have to submit. You're going to have to submit not just to something, because if it's just a rule, we tend to look for ways around the rule. We have to submit to someone smarter than we are, and more powerful than we are, and more persistent than we are, and older than we are. And of course, you want to submit to the person that is absolutely on top of everything. Well, that would be God. And so, it's no mystery why Kanye is making the kinds of moves that he's making. But then the atheists come along and say, we're gonna use Christian values to critique Christianity. But all along the way here, there's a problem of time and outcome, because again, modernity doesn't look back. Modernity is very full of itself, and it imagines, oh look, I have these new tools, I have this new power. I no longer have to pray to God to alleviate the famine. I'm going to develop agricultural technology that's going to manage the famine. And in fact, in a sense, in World War I, we developed better and better technology to kill people. And then we discovered in World War II that we're a little too good at this. And in fact, we developed the kind of technology that will kill us all. And so when our enemies got it, C.S. Lewis had to write Living in an Atomic Age, because suddenly we thought the modern dream that we can somehow secure for ourselves the lives we've always wanted, well, it's threadbare. And we realize that it's our very power that threatens us. And so one of the interesting things that we see in the modern critique of Christianity is that modernity is enormously short-sighted when looking to the past. Every time a problem presents itself, we grab for a technical solution, but we are unaware of what that technical solution involves. One of my favorite clips, and I should probably pull it up one of these days and play it, is Jordan Peterson talking about what the car is. Because we think a car is just a machine to get us from point A to point B, but Peterson notes that it's actually something that reshapes urban planning, and it's something that reshapes social relationships, and it's something that reshapes where people live. And Kanye talked about this, and well, it's the city, and now LA, we're going to have these big, beautiful freeways. Now you can get up on that big, beautiful freeway and sit on that great, big, beautiful freeway because there's too many cars in it. And it's something that tinkers with the chemistry of the atmosphere. And it's something that, again and again and again, a car is not simply something that gets us from A to B. A car is something that, in fact, will radically change many, many aspects of life on this planet for human beings. And we've not yet seen the ends of what cars will do because, of course, in the United States, there's just about one car for every person. But if you expand that to the world population, there are, I think, last time I looked at it, 4 cars for every 100 people. Now, what happens if the entire world has as many cars as people in the United States? Well, yeah. That's a problem. And so we see this, okay, what we want is a nice medieval village, but, well, the nice medieval village didn't die because we didn't like it. It died because we liked it too much, and it was no longer a village. And this is what we see again and again, even with, I look at scale with this YouTube thing, and fortunately, my channel isn't very big, and we actually had a conversation about this on the Discord server the other day, because they were sort of lamenting, I don't want people to find Paul's videos, because if they find Paul's videos, they'll get on the Discord server, and then we'll have all these other people on the Discord server, and our Discord server is a nice little medieval village with just little us, and we know each other, and we trust each other, and there aren't any trolls, and it's all wonderful and nice until, of course, open the door and the world rushes in, and there we have it. Now, I think part of this is Peterson in his Transliminal talk talked about Newtonian and Darwinian perspectives on the world. And in a sense, the modernists are Newtonian in that they imagine, well, a car is just a way to get from A to B. It's an immediate atomistic view of the world. A Darwinian perspective is sort of much more long-term. And if you ask what an automobile is in Darwinian terms, well, automobiles, again, now, this video is not about climate change. And I know I've got a lot of conservative people who watch this channel, and I guess you can keep debating in the comment section if you want to. It's not my point. But, if CO2, well, actually, cars are only a small segment of CO2s, but maybe cars are world changers and not just conveyances from A to B. And I'm going to propose something in a little bit that's a different thing besides CO2, because everybody then goes off on their triggers the great CO2 debate. But here's the thing. We have these little solutions, and Peterson again uses birth control. Well, birth control is a way of, now we can have sex without children. Again, I listened to that David Chappelle Netflix act, which was really quite something. And especially when he started talking about abortion, because he said, okay, women get to decide about abortion, but then men don't have to pay for the babies. I thought, well, there you go. I mean, there's so much built into everything that tiny little decisions that we make have consequences that we can't foretell. You have Gandalf telling Frodo in the Mines of Moria in the movie, where Frodo laments the fact that Bilbo didn't kill Gollum. And Gandalf reminds him, even the wise can't see all ends. But in modernity, we barely think about it. And I was watching another Netflix show that was talking basically about biotechnology and CRISPR and DNA and monkeying with DNA. And what's so amazing is that we've got all kinds of people who are, we're all excited about the latest technologies, but then this thing comes around and it's like, oh, I don't know about this if you're going to start monkeying with DNA. But, if you've got one of these diseases that is a genetic disease, we're all geeked about it. And so we don't know where this is going. And so, Brett Weinstein has these breathless warnings about, our capacity and our new powers, but we have little appreciation for the lack of wisdom that we have. And I often think when I watch Brett that he talks about, well, we need to have communities that can have conversations and have wisdom. And I think that's right. And actually what you need a great diversity of communities that have all these different spectrums of high openness to change, extreme Luddites, and you would want a text that could sort of ground all of those communities' conversations, and you would like a real significant paper trail of all of their thoughts of working through wisdom. And whenever I think about that and see that, I think, yeah, this is what Christianity, but also other religions have been doing forever. Religions have throughout the course of the world been the conversations about wisdom, and there's always been this let's not too hasty there, Master Hobbit, not too hasty, because we don't know where these things will end. And so now, instead of talking about carbon, let's talk about nitrogen. And again, a book that I recommend often, which is just a tremendously helpful book called The Alchemy of Air, which talks about the fixation of nitrogen. Because again, at the beginning of the 20th century, the best guess of the carrying capacity for the world was perhaps 4 billion people. And so Brett's looking for a number of, what would be a sustainable number? Well, the way you would get this, and again, if you watch the part of the debate, he's like, well, I want people to be able to live together in community because they need that to more and more community. And I said, well, the way to do that is take away their money. And then they have to. And then they have to deal with each other because they don't have easy outs. So, well, take away the fixation of nitrogen. You say, well, what's the fixation of nitrogen? Our entire civilization is based on it. All the chemical fertilizers have. Well, I only eat organic. Yeah, but the rest of the world really needs fertilizer because that's what keeps the crop yields up and perhaps to allow the world to sustain 10 billion people. But what happens to all of this nitrogen that we suck out of the air? Well, some of it we put into... You couldn't have had World War I without the fixation of nitrogen, because the same guy developed the gas for the battlefields and the nitrogen that was used in explosives and the nitrogen that was used in farming because the German lands were so worn out. You can read about it in The Alchemy of Air. It's an amazing story, but, well, what does that do now? How have we messed up the nitrogen cycle? So what we do is we employ technology to solve immediate problems, but we don't have the wisdom to know, well, what happens if we draw this nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil? Well, the plants will grow, yeah, but it'll also run out, and it'll run out into the seas, and you're going to have these huge algae blooms, and you're going to have all these fish die, and, well, is this good? Is this bad? Well, we don't know. And so we live in this short term, and the cumulative technological impact is large. And in this Netflix show about basically genetic engineering, well, that's the fear. Well, once we get things into what do they call it, the root stream, where now it's something that's heritable. So not only will you change something in me, but all of my children will have that change. Well, then suddenly we get the sense of, wow, our technology has consequences. And this isn't just true of nitrogen and carbon. And so then I hear these guys talk about, morality and well-being. And, well, here's the thing. The reason people can't live together is because they're all seeking their own well-being. And so often, my well-being would be that right now we've got my wife and my daughter living at home until the kids come back from college again. And well-being would be that I could get to, play computer games and watch all the TV I want and never have to cook or clean or pay for anything. That sounds like well-being to me. I don't think my wife and my daughter would be too keen on that idea of well-being. In fact, we have all this negotiated solution. And in fact, it isn't just these simple things. It goes, talk to people about the kinds of things that they fight over. And again, all of you have fights. All of you know people. All of you have disagreements. How on earth are we so naive when it comes to well-being? It's irrational. We're far more intuitive. Well-being has far more to do with a sense of it in terms of intuitive than direct. And this is why, again, the point I made in that debate. We have suicide among the affluent. Well, if we just have more money and more resources, well, what we'll have then is what we're getting now, which is people living in smaller and smaller family sizes, people not living together, and they're doing it because it's expedient, but it's not working long term. And we're far more communal than individual. And again, read Rene Girard's Mimetic Desire. Ironically, we want what we see other people wanting. And then we have rivalry. And then we have conflict. And then we have violence. Why is it that if a married woman shows up dead, or a woman living with a man, who's suspect number one? The person that says he loves her. Well, he does love her, and he also can't stand her, and probably vice versa. And so they're the threat to themselves. And this is what human beings are like. So, well, if we're wiser together, even if we can't stand each other in the now, well, then we're also much wiser if you look back into the past. Because, well, what you have in the past is a tremendous diversity of cultures, a tremendous diversity of lifestyles. In fact, the past is this enormous resource that our contemporary modernistic bias of what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery sort of biases us against, and probably to our doom. But now, that sets up the question, what do you do with the people you disagree with? Now, I'm going to play a little bit more of this Delling pod conversation with Tom Holland, because it really, really was good.
So that's not important. But what is important is the figure of Jesus in the Gospels. And that is remarkable enough, even if it bears no correspondence to a historical Jesus at all. Right. Because if you think about it, it's the most challenging literary gig you could possibly imagine. Imagine being told you've got to write a story in which, for the first time, somebody who suffers the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as in some way being a part of the one creator God who's fashioned everything. And he's got to be convincing not just to people now, but for 2,000 years and across the whole span of the world. It's a really astonishing thing to have pulled off as a literary feat, and that 4 people did it is amazing.
Now, what I love about this line is that, well, what would be the odds that I'm going to play this again, because this is an astounding thing that he observes.
So the figure of Jesus is no correspondence to a historical Jesus at all. Right. Because if you think about it, it's the most challenging literary gig you could possibly imagine. Imagine being told you've got to write a story in which, for the first time, somebody who suffers the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as in some way being a part of the one creator God who's fashioned everything. And And he's got to be convincing not just to people now, but for 2,000 years and across the whole span of the world. I mean, it's a really astonishing thing to have pulled off as a literary feat, and that 4 people did it is amazing.
And the fact that these 4 people did it all about the same guy. So the book, the literary feat itself, is amazing for all the ways that he just laid it out, and the fact that it's. I mean, you say, well, I really don't think that's true. Well, then please tell me why. Again, and I've made this point again and again. The Bible is the most printed, the most read, the most translated, the most. If someone would drop in from outer space and say, what's the most important book in all of human history? There's nothing even second. And so these 4 people devised this literary feat. And, Luke's Greek is pretty good. Mark, Matthew, and John, not as good. These are, in some senses, literary masterpieces, but the fact that they're all written within the same century about the same man speaks not just to the books, but to the man. And now, well, what would you call this man? Well, he's at the top of the hierarchy. And what's at the top of the hierarchy? God. I mean, you have to account for the shaping of the story. And modernity just kind of dismisses it. Well, it's, you can sort of dismiss it, but now we got Kanye, who's been given all of the fruits of modernity, and as a black man, okay, he's overcome white supremacy, and he's got lots and lots of money, he's got lots and lots of fame, and he can have any women that he wants, and he can. There's no limits on him getting what he desires, and he discovers that his biggest problem is himself. And so what he needs to do is find a master that is up to the task of wrangling him. And so, of course, we've got to look to God. Well, how can we know in human terms what God is? Because God is such a huge thing. Well, Christianity says, well, Jesus is how we know what God is. And so... But Jesus, we would expect Zeus or Hercules or Alexander the Great or one of the Caesars. Jesus, this loser who dies on a cross, this is God. And again, this is what Tom Holland is noticing and saying, This is the most astounding thing in all of human history, and it's in fact the basis for the critique that all of the atheists have and their complaints against the Christian that you're not being Christian enough. That's essentially what they're saying, but we're going to get into that in a little bit, but let's go on with this. Well, I got to play it again because it's just so good.
And the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as in some way being a part of the one creator God who's fashioned everything. And he's got to be convincing not just to people now, but for 2,000 years and across the whole span of the world. I mean, it's a really astonishing thing to have pulled off as a literary feat, and that 4 people did it is amazing. So the figure of Jesus is obviously kind of lies at the heart of it, and the understanding of and the crucifixion and the resurrection absolutely lies at the heart of it, and the understanding of what that means. What you get with Paul is he senses that something amazing has happened. He clearly thinks that Jesus has risen from the dead. He clearly thinks that Jesus has appeared to him. He's clearly been blinded by a sudden understanding that the Messiah, who he had imagined would be a warrior coming in glory, in fact was this broken figure who died bloodied and beaten on an implement of torture. And the revelation of this stupefies and bewilders and awes and stuns and excites and moves him and inspires him to spread the message across the Roman world. And the early centuries of Christianity are basically an attempt by Christians to understand what the hell is going on with this. Who is Jesus exactly? What is God's purpose? and the construction of what comes to be called orthodoxy, the kind of the straight path, the right way of doing things, is constructed over many, many centuries. Of course, what that also opens up is what do you then do with people who may disagree with you? And
burn them, obviously.
Well, not to begin with.
Right.
Not to begin with. It takes almost 1,000 years for the first people who are called heretics, people, in other words, it comes from the Greek, it means people who choose, by implication, the wrong way.
Right.
And even then the church is reluctant to do it, but what changes is, it reflects a kind of paradox at the heart of Christianity, which remains at the heart of liberalism as well, unsurprisingly, because liberalism is part of the fabric of Christian civilization, which is what do you do with people who do not want your universal message of love and brotherhood? And again, this goes back to Paul, because Paul writes to the Galatians and says that there is no Jew or Greek anymore. Christ has come, differences are gone. There are no differences between the Jews and the Greeks. We're all one in Christ. Which is amazingly, hippie do. Who doesn't love that? That's teach the world to sing, that kind of thing. Except that if you're a Jew and you don't want to be swallowed up in some kind of lovey-dovey universalist mush, then what are you going to do? And that really is the question that haunts Christians. The more powerful, the more essentially able to impose itself the church becomes. What do you do, for instance, with Jews lies at the that's a question that Christians are permanently bumping their heads against, to the misfortune of Jews. What do you do with Muslims? What do you do with pagans? What do you do with heretics? And over the course of the Middle Ages, the notion that you can burn and kill people in the name of love, that you can bully and pressure and harass and torment people for not loving enough, for not caring for the weak and the poor and the oppressed enough, generates this paradox, which is one that runs right the way through the Reformation. It's there clearly in the French Revolution, it's clearly there in the Russian Revolution, that you have to kill people to make them equal, and it's kind of there in the culture wars at the moment. If you're woke, you are awakened, and the idea of being awakened is an enduring Christian metaphor running throughout Anglo-American Protestantism, is the idea of great awakenings. And that idea in turn goes back to the writings of Luther, which in turn goes back through the writings of church and church fathers. The idea that you get awakened, the light, you've been brought to the light, you've recognized your sin, you've recognized that the sufferings of the weak and the oppressed and the poor, they have to be prioritized. They have a value. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. Yeah. And then the question comes, of course, well, what do you do with people who don't agree with you? And so just as inquisitors ended up happy to push people, heretics, to repent, and then if they didn't repent, hand them over to the secular arm to be burnt.
Yes.
So ever since then, there's been a pattern throughout Western history where people who see themselves as endowed with a kind of blinding, revelatory moral insight that justifies them in overthrowing a corrupt order, a depraved Babylon, be it Protestant reformers, be it French revolutionaries, be it woke academics, the same kind of essential dynamic is played out, and that also is a fundamental inheritance from the Christian past.
Yes. So
again, watch the whole thing. What do you do with you've got this command to love, and people don't love? Well, what do you do with the ones who don't love? There's this again. I recommended this article from from Slate Star Codex, Meditations on Molech. He has in it this fish farming story from non-libertarian frequent FAQ 2.0. As a thought experiment, let's consider aquaculture fish farming in a lake. Imagine a lake with 1,000 identical fish farms owned by 1,000 competing companies. Each fish farm earns a profit of $1,000 a month, and for a while all is well. But each fish farm produces waste, which fouls the water of the lake. Let's say that each fish farm produces enough pollution to lower productivity in the lake by $1 a month. 1,000 fish farms produce enough waste to lower productivity by $1,000 a month, meaning none of the fish farms are making any money. Capitalism to the rescue. Someone invents a complex filtering system that removes the waste product. It costs $300 a month to operate. All fish farms voluntarily install it. The pollution ends, and the fish farms are now making a profit of $700 a month. Still a respectable sum. But one fish farmer, let's call him Steve, one fish farmer gets tired of spending the money to operate his filter. Now one fish farm worth of waste is polluting the lake, lowering productivity by $1. Steve earns $999 profit, and everyone else earns $699 profit. Everyone sees Steve is more profitable than they are because he's not spending the maintenance cost on his filter. So they disconnect their filters too. Once 400 people disconnect their filters, Steve is earning $600 a month, less than he would than if he and everyone else had kept their filters on. And the poor virtuous filter users are only making $300. Steve goes around to everyone saying, wait, we all need to make voluntary pact to use filters. Otherwise, everyone's productivity will go down. Everyone agrees with him, and they all sign the filter pact, except one person who is sort of a jerk. Let's call him Mike. Now everyone is back using filters again, except Mike. And Mike earns $999 a month, and everyone else earns $699 a month. Slowly, people start thinking they too should be getting big bucks like Mike, and they disconnect their filters for the extra $300 profit. A self-interested person never has any incentive to use a filter. A self-interested person has some incentive to sign a pact to make everyone use a filter, but in many cases has a strong incentive to wait for everyone else to sign a pact, but opt out himself. This can lead to an undesirable equilibrium in which no one will sign a pact. This is how we are as human beings. And so what do? It's all about love. Well, what if you stop loving? Well, can we afford love? That then is the question. But it isn't a question that arrives after the Gospels. It, in fact, is the context of the Gospels because that's what Jesus comes into. Now, part of the question that we have, okay, well, maybe we'll just have this, we'll have everyone sign the pact. And in a sense, that's sort of what happens when you adopt a religion together. Okay, everyone is a Christian. Well, then we couldn't decide everyone in Europe was a Christian, but then we had all these different kinds of Christians, and some were better Christians than others. They were monks and priests, but some of those monks and priests were corrupt, and so on and on and on. And so then when the corruption reached a certain level, some of the people in Germany no longer wanted to pay for the Medicis and their church building ambitions in Rome, and so nuts to you, we're not going to send money down anymore. We're going to back this Luther guy because Luther is sincere, and Luther's a true monk, and that's today's Reformation Day. And Luther wrote his 99 Theses in Latin, and then his students translated into German. Again, read Fatal Discord. You can read that whole story. So what's the essence of Christianity? Because maybe if we can discern its essence, then we'll know who's a Christian and who isn't a Christian. Well, should it be dying for your neighbors? Well, that doesn't seem like a very prominent thing. Often when I'll tell people about the gospel, they'd say, well, who'd want to believe this? Loving God and your neighbor? Well, yeah, loving your neighbor. I want everybody to love their neighbor, but what is love going to cost? A set of moral commands? Well, here's the 10 commandments. People who follow these commandments, they're Christians, and people who don't follow those commandments, they're not. But what do you do with the thief on the cross? Surely you'll be with me in paradise. Well, maybe it's belief. I noticed, I watched a video of Kanye's pastor, and he was on this other reformed podcast, and they went through this long list of all these tiny little elements of belief that I understand because I'm well versed in this stuff, but most of you listening to it be like, what are these guys talking about? Well, I'll tell you what it was. It was dogs sniffing each other's butts. Because are you up to snuff in terms of all the beliefs that you subscribe to? As long as you subscribe to all of these beliefs, but then you'll have to think, yeah, but are you really living like you believe in all these beliefs? And round and round and round we go with this game. Maybe it's loyalty to an institution. Well, that's exactly what broke apart in the Protestant Reformation. In fact, it broke apart 500 years before that in the division of the Eastern and the Western Church. Well, it's embracing the right moral framework. But what we see is that the atheists already embrace at least part of the moral framework, and their argument is that Christians aren't Christian enough. You don't love enough. You don't love gays enough. You don't love trans enough. You don't love non-Christians enough. You're burning people at the stake. That's not Christian, is it? Jesus walks into the garden and says, if any blood's going to be shed, it's going to be mine. And if all Christians act like that, we think about it, we say, if they all act like that, then they'll all be gone. We want it embodied. And we don't want just an embodied in me. We want it embodied in a village. And then we'll have a pact and an agreement. And again, go to Plymouth Plantation and listen to, well, church is mandatory. Again, listen to the conversation I had in the debate. I don't think it made the cut in terms of, what we need is to convince everyone about this selflessness and this communitarianism and all of this. And it's like, well, maybe what if everybody met together like one day a week and someone would give a message about all of those values and tell them how to do it. And maybe, we would hold each other accountable. And if you didn't play by the rules, then you wouldn't be allowed to participate in the little rituals. And what we do is we redo the church because that's the reasonable thing to do. But what we find is that it's insufficient. So we keep trying to go out into the wilderness and build it again. And if it's successful, its very success will destroy it. And so we say, well, is this workable? It's always beyond our grasp. When it's incarnate, we kill it. Jordan Peterson makes the comment, following Nietzsche, who thought that this was all a terrible, terrible problem, that everybody adopted this moral attitude that Tom Holland is recognizing all the atheists have. And Nietzsche says that's a terrible idea, because if people act this way, we won't rise up. Rise up to what? Have the normal bloodshed that we see in humanity? When we saw it incarnate, the one true Christian, we killed him. because he led us. and so what you see is, well, that keeps happening, isn't it? And yeah, it does. Well, and then we think, well, that's no strategy for the future because we want to secure our strategy for the future. Well, it's sort of the opposite of faith, because faith and securing are the opposite. So when it was incarnate, we kill it. And when it is explained, we reject it. Because living like Jesus gets you what Jesus got. And the more you live like Jesus, the more you will annoy people. And you will annoy them because, as the Gospel of John says, you make them look bad. And people can endure a lot of things, but they can't endure being made to look bad. Especially if they are not full of Jesus. Because if you're full of Jesus and you're humble, hey, this is part of the reason I like Calvinism. Someone says to me, you're a bigot. Yep. You're sexist. Yep. I'm all these things. Well, people would say, yeah, but Paul, you don't treat black people poorly or Hispanic. I don't see you treating anyone poorly, right? But that doesn't mean those sins aren't in my heart. And it doesn't mean that all of those sins aren't in my heart. And it doesn't mean that if not given all of the money and opportunity that Kanye had, I wouldn't lose control. And well, then you come around full cycle, right? Because you learn, gosh, you give me all this money, I can't control myself. I need to turn my life over to a master. And he can't just be a rule of life. It has to be a person, because I'm a really smart lawyer and I'm always finding ways around the rule. And what I need is someone who will who will both be a judge, but also a partner. Well, how could I find something like that? Well, pretty quickly you're at the doctrine of the Trinity. And if you live like Jesus, you'll get what Jesus got. And if you cut out the resurrection, Nietzsche's critique begins to sound plausible. Because, well, who would want to live this way? Because someone's going to cheat and someone's going to kill you. But here's the crazy thing. It's still going 2,000 years later. Well, Christianity can't survive when people kill Christians. Well, it's still here. It survived the Roman Empire. It survived many empires. Why? Because you can't kill an idea. You can kill the people, but once that idea gets out, and once it goes viral, but then you're back to if you go Nietzsche's route, you're back to a Hobbesian war of all against all, which is a Darwinian field of blood that dies long before the heat death of the universe. So what are your options? Well, if you know all this, you begin to look at, well, gosh, people have thought about this. People have reflected on this. These issues are not new. If you look behind us, you can say, yeah, ahead probably looks something like behind. And so then you begin to see the shape of theology. And so, well, for this thing to work, the resurrection must come. And so we believe in a second coming, and I believe in the resurrection of the dead. Read the Apostles' Creed. Alistair McGrath makes the point that, well, what heresy is ideas that paint Christianity into a corner. As I mentioned in my last video, Christianity is a very tricky thing, because just when you think it's painted into a corner, it breaks out, and a crazy guy like Kanye West is going to start doing Sunday services that have such beautiful music. People are going to say, I don't know how long he's going to be a Christian, but there sure is something to this idea. And again, just watch my conversation with Vaush. I have these conversations all the time, and people are like, well, what kind of person do you want to be? Well, I want to get everyone I want. Well, what kind of person do you want your neighbor to be? Do you want them to be selfless and kind and considerate and to sacrifice for your well-being? Well, of course I want people to live like that, but just not me. Well, then you're in that fish farming gig. But it doesn't work. We can't scale it up. If we're so successful in the medieval village, then it becomes a city, and then it all breaks down. And, well, it always breaks down. But that doesn't mean you stop bearing witness. At the beginning of the book of Acts, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, the disciples are around Jesus, and they say, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? We really thought it was going to be, like Paul was thinking about too, that you're going to gather us together as an army, and we'd be your lieutenants, and we would take city after city, and we would, conquer Judea, and we'd take the temple, and we'd conquer Galilee, and then we'd move up, and we'd conquer Antioch, and then we'd move up, and we'd conquer Asia Minor, then we'd hop over, and we'd conquer Greece, and we'd blaze a trail all the way to Rome with behind you swinging a sword, as has been done again and again and again throughout history. And Jesus says, did you learn nothing from the cross? Did you learn nothing from the resurrection? Times and dates, that's up to the Father. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. What kind of power? The power to be bold and then to die. Well, who wants that? You will receive power, and you will be my witnesses. Power to do what? Power to love people who are not deserving love. Power to love immoral people. Power to love that one stupid fish farmer who won't agree to the filter pack. Power to love, because love transforms. Well, the thing is, if you don't believe the end of the story, you don't believe that this makes any sense, because it's all just up to you to be selfish. And then the world dies in the most predictable, common way. You will receive power and the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses. That's what you will do, and you'll die doing it. Yeah, but will I have fun? You will have joy. That's what this is about.